Hi, I'm Rashim, independent scholar, social science researcher. One of the ways in which, of course, I became interested is through my own actual experience. One, my mother, being a welfare recipient and a mother of five children, also seeing her work so hard. And then later in life, myself being a person who was getting public assistance from the federal government, and then also transitioning to a space where I was no longer on welfare. I think so often we see so much information about the statistics of Black women who are receiving public assistance, but very little is known about the women who go beyond the poverty threshold and exactly how they do it. Some of the reason that may be the case is because once folks are off welfare, there's such stigma with it that perhaps folks don't necessarily want to have that conversation or even talk about it or reference that at one point they were on welfare. But I figured and feel like if it is a solution, the solution will be in speaking with Black women who at one point was in poverty and then reached beyond the poverty threshold. So that's how I became interested in doing this work. So, in order to have a conversation around how Black women have traditionally been treated as mothers, we have to first look at how Black women have been just historically treated, let's say, in this country, right? As folks who were African, brought to this country, enslaved, they weren't really looked at as mothers. They were looked at as property. So any children that they would have would be a production, an addition then to the labor force. So as we were as a country, or the US as a country was establishing, conceptualizing what it meant to be a mother, Black women were left out of that formulation of exactly what it meant to be a mother, what it looked like to be a mother. So we didn't have a frame for to even see them as mother. At most, Black women, if they were perceived as maternal, they would probably be more so perceived as what would be referred to as a mammy. And what that is they would be working, that would require them also working outside of their home, and not taking care of their children directly because those children weren't their property to begin with, weren't really theirs to begin with, but then taking care of the children of the owning class, right? And that was a function of Black women in this country. Now, then you have, if we go, let's speed jump several years and let's jump into 1960s, even more specifically 1965, and the creation, the writing of the Moynihan Report. Now, in this report, it is a call to action about the Black family, um, and it investigates some of the challenges and issue and perceived issues within the Black family. Two of the main things that the Moynihan Report reflects as it relates to Black women and their families is the absence of fathers and the female-headed households as the primary issues. So this, at that point, started to paint Black women as not only the causes of poverty. They were the causes of not only their poverty, but the poverty of their entire family. So you start to see the further development and the construction of welfare as a feminist issue that originated with NWRO in 1968 with the then president, Johnny Tillman. And one of the things that Tillman was able to identify was that the way that we engage with welfare and how we looked at it, specifically as it relates to women, was that what it actually reflected was public anxieties about all women's preference for economic independence, their preference for personal autonomy and social justice. One of the ways in which this impacted social work, first of all, is a value-based uh, profession. It has a set of values, and those values are highly influenced by popular concepts and beliefs about what is right and what is true and what is just and how things should be. right? One of the greatest influences of that, as it relates to how we view women on welfare, in addition to things like slavery and the Moynihan Report, is something that Barbara Welther outlined as she refers to it as the cult of true womanhood. Now, in the cult of true womanhood, it has a few things that it identifies as this is what makes a good woman, this is what makes a real woman. And then in some of those, it identifies what makes the ideal mother. So some of those things of what makes an ideal mother are strict adherence to gender roles, reliance on a male breadwinner, um, piety, virginity. In fact, at on a woman's wedding night, her first gift to her husband was her virginity, and the second gift that she's supposed to give him was a child. So you have these constructs for how we view what is right and what is valued. So the impact of that is that then informs social work about who is worthy and unworthy, who's the worthy and unworthy poor, right? In this, you see also the use of fiscal sanctions and the push for marriage as a solution to poverty. That increased quite a bit as the years progress, right? Now, you also, if we're looking at welfare and all of the different forms, you have aid to dependent children, which is now called aid to families with dependent children. This originally excluded women largely. It was an element, the newer version that we have was an element of the New Deal that was established under the Social Security Act of 1935. It was the first federal program that provided cash support to families, or even more specifically, to mothers. Mothers, again, were not originally included in that particular policy. Their inclusion happened in the early 1950s. Now, with the inclusion of mothers in the 1950s, there is an establishment of what is considered worthy and unworthy mothers, right? If you were divorced, you were not considered a worthy mother. If you had never been married, you would not be considered a worthy mother. Worthy mothers were folks who may have been widowed, so you get things like a widow's pension. And even though that was a federal program, local organizations, local programming had free reign in terms of like how they implement it. So that gives them all the freedom that they need to exclude Black mothers quite easily. So then you start to see drumming up in the media the portrayal of bad mothers emanating from slavery that became part of the assumptions that kind of undergird the implementation of certain aspects of the New Deal programming and social work policies. So as the state was seeking to regulate maternal behavior, because now you see Black mothers, they are no longer, the children that they produce are no longer seen as like part of the economic labor force. You start to see stronger sanctions, higher interest in reducing the number of Black and brown children born. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a very strong push to portray Black women as unworthy citizens, strip them of entitlements by blaming African American women for, again, both creating their own poverty and that of their entire communities. So there's a troubled history between social work and African American mothers. This troubled relationship shows up in research and education and well as practice. And how it shows up in the literature is much of the literature on African American mothers have focused on studying their deviation from the cult of true womanhood, right? So you remember the cult of true womanhood emphasizes things like their marital status. So you start to see studies like unwed mothers. It also, another way in which it studied the deviation from the cult of true womanhood was studying things like whether or not the household was female head. So if you look into a lot of social work literature, you'll see there's a lot that just focus on uh, studying and getting the statistics for female-led household, or the residential absence of a biological father, or their positioning or roles within their families, like looking at headship, who's the head in that, and then making decisions. So that comes up in the literature, but it doesn't stay in the literature because then that impacts policies. And then of course those policies then go into feeding into a lot of the programs that we have. Sometime later, you have the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. It's very wordy. That was a law in 1996, signed into law by President Clinton. Now, this marked a significant turning point in U.S. social policy targeting women's work behavior, right? So rather than addressing the structural issues that contributed to the conditions of Black women and why they were in poverty, very true to its name, it emphasized personal responsibility. What is it? Personal responsibility and work were a key aspect of it, right? And this personal responsibility was supposed to be the cause and the cure to all poverty. One of the ways in which it changed things was participation in employment programs were then mandatory in order to receive support. It didn't matter if you had 4 or 5 children and you didn't have child care support for them. It was a requirement for you to go to work. It had very strict work requirements. It also gave states a lot more control and increased the roles of non-government sectors in the implementation of how this was carried out. Now, birthed out of PRWORA was Temporary Aid to Needy Families, or TANF. That began to actually replace AFDC and was designed with the intentions of moving participants from welfare to the workforce very quickly. I think it's very important to note that TANF did things like impose new time limits, like the amount of time that you could actually receive public assistance. And the real goal was not to get them out of poverty, it was just to reduce the caseload and make sure that they were working. One of the things I think would be very helpful if people understood about the working poor is that Black women who can only find low wage service jobs are part of that working poor and are most likely to end up in a cycle of poverty that they can't simply work themselves out of. So if I make, for example, 63 cents to every dollar of my white male counterpart, there is no catching up with that math. In fact, according to the Department of Labor, Black women do earn 63 cents to every dollar of their white male counterparts. So it's not something where they're not working enough. Black women are working 2 jobs, 5 jobs, multiple times, doing gigs on the side. So even when we control for education, Black women still earn less, for example, than white men. Another thing that is important for folks to understand about the working poor, and even more specifically, Black women as the working poor, is that Black women are in the labor force at a higher rate than any other mothers in the United States. One of the things I think the US gets wrong about Black women and welfare is that they aren't working hard enough. I also think that there's a particular focus on personal responsibility and not enough attention played to the structural barriers and conditions that generate and create poverty. I really want folks to be able to understand that if you are paid less, according to all of the statistics, everything that we look at says that Black women are paid less. And then if you add to that, we are working more than any other moms or any other women in the United States. That's one of the things that for some reason we seem to get wrong, that it's that they're not working enough and we ignore that they're not paid enough. I think that that deserves further investigation. If we're going to begin to heal the troubled history between African American mothers in the field of social work, it will require centering mothers in their own analysis, including them in decision-making bodies at the policy table, and also including the contributions of African American social workers. specifically social workers that go beyond the deficit model and the deficit standpoint.